You are standing on a deck of solid English oak, but you cannot feel the wood beneath your boots. What you feel instead is the terrifying, absolute stillness of a world that has frozen solid around you. The year is 1847, though numbers have long ceased to mean anything in this vast, blinding emptiness. The air you inhale is so sharp, so unimaginably cold, that it feels less like oxygen and more like a physical blade sliding down your throat, coating your lungs in a thin layer of frost. Around you, the dark hulls of the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror are no longer majestic machines of British imperial pride. They are black, jagged teeth, trapped in the crushing jaw of the Arctic ice pack. Listen closely to the silence. It is not empty. It is a heavy, suffocating weight that presses against your temples. A thick and suffocating blanket woven from miles of undisturbed snow and ancient ice. If you listen even closer, beneath the silence, you can hear the ship itself crying out. It is a low, agonizing groan from deep within the hold. The sound of massive timber beams bowing under a pressure they were never designed to withstand. The ice fields of the Victoria Strait are closing in, centimeter by centimeter, squeezing the life out of these massive, iron-reinforced vessels. The ice does not rush. It does not panic. It has all the time in the world. And it knows, with a cruel and mathematical certainty, that you have nowhere left to run. You look out across the horizon, but your eyes cannot find a single point of comfort. There are no trees here. There are no landmarks. No rising smoke from distant chimneys. No green hills of home. There is only an endless, undulating desert of white, gray, and bruised purple shadows under a sun that offers no warmth for months out of the year. That sun does not even bother to rise, leaving you in a perpetual, twilight state where day and night blur into one continuous nightmare. The light that does exist is deceptive. It plays tricks on your fragile human mind. Sundogs and mirages dance across the horizon, twisting the landscape into phantom mountains and shifting walls of ice that make you question whether you are looking at reality or the first fractures of your own sanity. Step down the companionway, leaving the bitter wind behind, and enter the belly of the ship. You might expect warmth here, a cozy refuge from the polar desert. But instead, you are greeted by a damp, subterranean chill that clings to your skin like a wet shroud. The air down here is thick and stagnant, smelling of whale oil lamps, wet wool, rotting potatoes, and the sour, unmistakable scent of human fear. The walls are slick with condensation that has frozen into sheets of gray ice right next to the hammocks where the men sleep. You can hear them breathing in the dark. Shallow, ragged gasps from men whose bodies are slowly, systematically consuming themselves from the inside out. They are the finest sailors the Royal Navy has to offer, hand-picked for this glorious expedition to find the Northwest Passage. But now they look like ghosts inhabiting a floating tomb. You walk past the officers' mess, where silver forks and fine porcelain plates sit on a table that tilts slightly to the port side. It is a pathetic display of Victorian civility, a desperate attempt to pretend that London is just around the corner, that the rules of the civilized world still apply out here in the wastes. But the ocean does not care about British heraldry. The ice does not respect the Queen's commission. On the table sits a half-eaten bowl of tinned meat, its fat congealed into a gray, nauseating paste. If you look closely at the edges of that tin, you might see a dull, metallic smear. The lead solder, used to seal the provisions in a rush to meet the Admiralty's deadlines. It is a silent, microscopic poison slipping into the bloodstream of every man on board with every single bite they take, quietly dismantling their minds and bodies while they sleep. In the captain's cabin, a single candle flickers, its weak flame fighting against the draft that snakes through the seams of the bulkheads. The maps laid out on the desk are beautifully detailed, filled with bold ink lines that trace the coastlines of Africa, India, and the Americas. But here, at the top of the world, the maps go terrifyingly blank. The lines simply stop, fading into an empty white void labeled unexplored. Sir John Franklin and his officers believed they could conquer that void with iron, steam, and British willpower. They believed that human ingenuity could tame the wild, chaotic forces of nature. Now, that void has swallowed them whole, and the empty space on the map has become a physical prison from which there is no escape. You can feel the psychological claustrophobia settling over the crew like a heavy fog. When a man is trapped in a space no larger than a cottage for 2 years with over 100 other souls, the human mind begins to warp. Every cough, every nervous tick, every repetitive clearing of a throat becomes an assault on the senses. The camaraderie that sustained them during the first year has curdled into a tense, volatile suspicion. Men stare at one another across the dimly lit mess deck, searching each other's faces for the first signs of physical or mental decay. Who will be the first to break? Whose gums are bleeding a little too much today? Who was heard whispering to themselves in the coal bunkers last night? Outside, the polar night deepens, and with the darkness comes a profound, existential isolation. You are thousands of miles away from anyone who knows your name, anyone who loves you. To the people back in England, you are a hero on a grand adventure, a name printed in the newspapers, a toast raised in warm London pubs. They imagine you sailing triumphantly through open blue waters, charting new worlds for the glory of the empire. They do not see you here, shivering in the dark, watching your breath freeze in midair, listening to the ice groan like a dying beast. They do not know that you are already dead. The world just hasn't received the news yet. The madness of the Franklin expedition did not begin with a sudden, violent outburst. It began like this, with a slow, agonizing accumulation of quiet miseries. It began with the realization that the ships were not moving, that the summer thaw was not coming, and that the modern technology they trusted with their lives was completely, utterly useless against the primal, unyielding power of the frost. It is the realization that you are completely alone in the universe, trapped in a frozen laboratory where nature is conducting a cruel experiment on how long a human being can maintain his humanity before he reverts to an animal state. As you close your eyes and try to find a moment of fitful sleep beneath your damp blankets, the ship shudders violently. A massive ridge of ice has just buckled against the stern. A sound like a cannon shot echoing through the timber. No one moves. No one cries out. The men have become accustomed to the violence of the landscape. They simply lie there in the dark, staring at the frosted ceiling, waiting for morning that will look exactly like the night. You realize, with a chilling clarity, that the expedition is no longer about discovery or empire or glory. It is about survival in its purest, ugliest form. And as the cold seeps deeper into your bones, a terrifying question begins to whisper in the back of your mind. When the food runs out and the madness takes hold completely, what will you be willing to do to survive just one more day in this white hell. You are standing inside the towering, cavernous warehouses of the Deptford victualling yard on the banks of the River Thames. The air here is a suffocating mixture of molasses, salted pork, wet hemp, and the sharp chemical tang of fresh solder. It is the spring of 1845, and the atmosphere is electric with an almost arrogant optimism. All around you, hundreds of workers are rushing to load the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror with the ultimate fruits of Victorian industrial might. You watch as massive wooden crates, stenciled with the broad arrow of the Royal Navy, are swung into the dark holds of the ships. There are 3 years' worth of provisions being packed into these vessels. Thousands of gallons of rum, tons of ship's biscuit, flour and chocolate, and most impressively, over 8,000 tins of preserved meats, soups, and vegetables. Look closely at those tin cans. They are the crowning glory of modern British science, a brand new technology meant to banish the historic curse of scurvy from the high seas forever. The Admiralty has placed its absolute trust in a London provisioner named Stephen Goldner, who secured the contract by underbidding his competitors to meet the impossibly tight deadline before the ships must sail. Goldner's workshops are operating at a frantic, chaotic pace. You can see the young boys and underpaid laborers working late into the night under the dim hiss of gas lamps, hastily slopping molten lead solder along the seams of the tin plates. They are sealing the food, yes, but they are also sealing a death warrant in their haste. Large droplets of lead are splashing into the interior of the cans, settling into the meat like tiny, toxic pebbles, waiting to dissolve into the food during the long months of storage. Step onto the polished quarterdeck of the Erebus, where Sir John Franklin stands surrounded by his officers. He is a man of 60, short, heavy-set, and possessed of a gentle, deeply religious disposition. To the public, he is the man who ate his boots, a legendary survivor of a disastrous overland Arctic expedition 20 years prior. But if you look past the glittering gold epaulets and the medals pinned to his chest, you can see a profound, desperate vulnerability in his eyes. Franklin did not take this command out of a youthful thirst for adventure. He took it because his previous post as governor of Van Diemen's Land had ended in political humiliation and bureaucratic backstabbing. He needs this expedition to salvage his name, to secure his family's financial future, and to prove to the Admiralty that he is not too old, too soft, or too broken for the service of the Queen. Beside him stands his second-in-command, Captain Francis Crozier of the Terror. You can feel a silent, simmering tension between these two men. Crozier is an Irishman, a brilliant navigator, and a veteran of both Arctic and Antarctic voyages. He knows the polar ice better than almost anyone alive. Yet, because of his Irish heritage and his lack of high society connections, the Admiralty has repeatedly passed him over for supreme command. He is a man shadowed by a quiet melancholy, nursing a broken heart after being rejected by Franklin's own niece. Crozier looks out at the grand preparations, not with patriotic fervor, but with a cold, professional apprehension. He knows that the ice does not care about British social hierarchies or political redemption. He knows what the Arctic can do to a man's mind. You look down into the engine rooms, and you see the true arrogance of the age. For the first time in history, polar exploration vessels are being outfitted with locomotive steam engines. These massive iron beasts, ripped straight from the London and Greenwich Railway, have been dropped into the bellies of the wooden ships to turn heavy, experimental bronze propellers. The ships have been reinforced with internal beams of English oak and wrapped in sheets of iron plating at the bows, designed to ram through the floes like unstoppable battering rams. The officers boast that they have brought internal heating systems, miles of iron pipes that will circulate hot water through the lower decks, ensuring that the men will never have to feel the bite of the Arctic winter. They believe they have conquered nature with coal, iron, and steam. They believe they are leaving the vulnerabilities of the past behind on the docks of London. But you can already see the cracks in the foundation of this grand enterprise. The steam engines are heavy, consuming immense amounts of coal and drastically reducing the space available for fresh water and extra clothing. The internal heating system is experimental, prone to leaking and creating a damp, tropical humidity below decks that will quickly rot the timbers and breed mold in the dark. Worse still, the crew has been selected based on their obedience and traditional naval discipline, not their experience with the unique, brutal realities of the far north. They are men trained to pull ropes, scrub decks, and follow orders without question. They know nothing of how to hunt the seal or the walrus on the moving ice pack. They know nothing of how to build shelters from snow, or how to read the subtle, shifting language of the polar weather. They are completely dependent on the mechanical womb of their ships. On May 19, 1845, the ships weigh anchor from Greenhithe. You can hear the deafening cheers of the crowds lining the riverbanks, the waving of handkerchiefs, and the triumphant brass bands playing Rule Britannia across the water. The weather is clear, the sky a brilliant, hopeful blue. To the onlookers, this is the final act of a centuries-old drama. The Northwest Passage, the elusive shortcut to the riches of the Orient, is finally within Great Britain's grasp. The expedition is seen not as a gamble, but as a victory lap for the global empire. By July, the ships have reached Whalefish Islands off the western coast of Greenland. This is the final staging area, the last point of contact with the civilized world. You are present on the deck as a transport ship unloads the last crates of fresh supplies and takes aboard the final letters from the men to their families back home. The letters are filled with a bright, almost childlike confidence. Young officers write of their expectations to be home by Christmas, of the promotions they will receive, of the grand tales they will tell their children. They speak of Sir John Franklin with a deep, reverent affection, calling him a father figure who ensures that the ships are filled with laughter and good cheer. Among the letters is one from a young Marine, writing to his mother. He describes the magnificent libraries they have on board. Over 200 volumes of history, science, and poetry in each ship. He mentions the barrel organ that can play 50 different tunes, ensuring that the dark winter nights will be filled with music and dancing. He describes the warmth of the lower decks and the abundance of the tinned soups. He writes with the total, unshakable faith of a young man who believes that the British flag is an invisible shield against disaster. You watch as the transport ship turns south, its sails disappearing into the Atlantic mists, leaving the Erebus and Terror alone on the edge of the unknown. A few days later, 2 whaling ships spot the expedition in Baffin Bay, moored to an iceberg, waiting for the ice in Lancaster Sound to clear so they can plunge into the archipelago. The whalers describe the men as being in high spirits, waving their caps and shouting greetings across the open water. This is the last time any civilized eye will ever see them alive. As the ships sail west, entering the labyrinth of the Arctic islands, the shadows of their origin begin to lengthen. The beautiful, shiny tin cans, stacked in the darkness of the holds, are already beginning to slowly leach their toxic heavy metal into the food. The coal supply is already dwindling. With every hour, the heavy locomotive engines are fired up. The warm, humid air from the heating pipes is already condensing against the cold iron bolts of the hull, creating a silent, invisible rot. The very tools meant to guarantee their survival are already beginning to fail them, transforming the ships from cutting-edge marvels of the Victorian age into beautifully designed traps, sailing deeper and deeper into a trap from which no amount of iron or willpower can save them. You are standing on the frozen limestone gravel of Beachy Island, a desolate, wind-swept finger of rock jutting into the northern waters. It is the spring of 1846, and the first Arctic winter has finally broken. For months, the Erebus and Terror sat locked in a white gloom, their topmasts struck, their decks housed over with heavy canvas to trap what little warmth the coal fires could provide. The men have survived their first taste of the polar night. But the price of this initial victory is already etched into the landscape. If you walk just a few hundred yards from the shoreline, away from the clutter of empty tin cans and wood shavings left by the carpenters, your eyes settle upon 3 stark, wooden grave markers rising from the permafrost. Read the names carved into the wood: John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain. They were young men, a stoker and 2 private Marines, dead before the expedition had even reached its true crucible. The official logs would blame the climate, respiratory failure, or tuberculosis. But if you could peer beneath the soil into their frozen tissues, you would see a far more sinister truth. Their bodies are already saturated with lead. The beautiful, shiny tins of food have begun to do their silent work. In the close quarters of the ships, these men were the first to weaken, their immune systems quietly dismantled by the heavy metal poisoning. Their deaths have cast a subtle, unspoken shadow over the crew. The grand illusions of a quick, painless triumph through the Northwest Passage are beginning to thaw, replaced by a cold realization. This land does not tolerate mistakes. Yet, as the summer of 1846 arrives, a brief surge of hope sweeps through the vessels. The ice pack in Lancaster Sound fractures under the summer sun, opening leads of dark, glittering water. Sir John Franklin stands on the bridge, his old eyes scanning the horizon through a brass telescope. He gives the order to fire up the locomotive boilers. You can feel the vibration running through the ship's timber as the experimental bronze propellers bite into the sea, pushing the vessels south into Peel Sound. They are moving again. The engines hiss and roar, black coal smoke billowing into the pristine Arctic sky, a defiant symbol of human industry challenging the wilderness. For a few glorious weeks, it feels as though the gamble has paid off. The ships push deeper into uncharted waters than any European vessel before them. They sail past steep, frowning cliffs of red stone and vast empty bays, mapping lines that had been blank spaces just months prior. The strategy seems flawless. By bypassing the known, ice-blocked routes to the west and driving straight down this southern channel, they believe they are on the very verge of breaking through to the open waters of the Pacific. The atmosphere in the officers' mess returns to one of refined confidence. Toast after toast is raised to the Queen, to the Admiralty, and to Franklin himself, who feels the sting of his past political failures fading with every mile they chart. But the Arctic is a patient predator. It does not confront you with an immediate, dramatic storm. It simply opens its hand to let you walk deeper into its trap, and then it quietly closes its fist. It is September 12th, 1846. You're on deck as the sun begins to dip low on the horizon, casting impossibly long, pale shadows across the sea. The temperature drops with a terrifying suddenness, plummeting dozens of degrees in a matter of hours. Around the ships, the water begins to change texture. It becomes thick, greasy, and slushy, a phenomenon the sailors call frazzle ice. Within minutes, these floating crystals congeal into pancake-shaped disks, and before the engines can even bring the ships around to seek shelter, the disks fuse into a single massive, unbroken sheet of white. The Erebus and Terror jar to a violent halt just off the northern coast of King William Island. At first, there is no panic. The officers consult their charts and realize they are only a few miles from the known waters of the American coastline. If they can just force the ships through this final barrier, the passage is theirs. Franklin orders the crew onto the ice with massive ice saws and iron crowbars. You watch the men labor in the freezing wind, their breath forming thick icicles on their woolen comforters. They cut giant blocks of ice, trying to carve a canal for the ships to move forward. But it is like trying to empty an ocean with a thimble. For every block they cut and push aside, the immense pressure of the moving ice pack shoves 3 more into its place. The ice is thousands of square miles in extent, driven by the relentless winds and currents of the Beaufort Sea, and it is pressing down upon the ships with the weight of a continent. By October, the attempt is abandoned. The ships are frozen fast, embedded in the ice like flies in amber. They will not move again this year. The canvas housing is erected over the decks once more, and the routine of the winter camp begins. But this time, the mood is fundamentally different from the winter at Beechy Island. The coal reserves are dangerously low. The locomotive engines have consumed far more than anticipated during the summer push. To conserve fuel, the hot water heating system is turned off. The interior of the ships plunges into a damp, freezing darkness. You walk through the lower decks of the Terror in the dead of winter. The only light comes from small, sputtering lamps, burning rancid seal grease or whale oil. The air is so cold that the moisture from the men's breath condenses on the underside of the deck planks, freezing into a thick layer of rime. When the men sleep, the heat from their bodies melts a small circle in the frost above their hammocks, causing a cold, dirty water to drip continuously onto their faces. They are living in a refrigerator, wrapped in blankets that are permanently stiff with ice. It is during these dark, frozen months of early 1847 that the lead poisoning begins to mutate from a physical ailment into a psychological plague. The heavy metal has been accumulating in their brains, disrupting neurotransmitters and eroding the fragile veneer of Victorian discipline. You can see it in the way the men interact. Simple conversations degenerate into paranoid arguments. The officers, once fastidious about their appearance and protocol, begin to neglect their duties. Mood swings are frequent and unpredictable. Men who were once known for their good humor become sullen, withdrawn, or suddenly prone to unprovoked outbursts of rage. Captain Crozier watches this deterioration with a growing, helpless dread. He can see the physical signs of scurvy appearing as well. The swollen, blackened gums, the reopening of old wounds, the profound, leaden fatigue that makes even lifting a tin of meat feel like an impossible chore. He brings his concerns to Franklin, but the old commander remains trapped in his own psychological fortress of optimism. Franklin believes that the coming summer of 1847 will bring a historic thaw. He believes that God will not abandon an expedition sent on such a noble Christian mission. He spends his days reading scripture in his cabin, his mind increasingly detached from the grim reality developing just outside his door. The winter of 1847 stretches out, seemingly endless, until finally, the calendar says it is June. The sun returns, staying in the sky for 24 hours a day, but it brings no relief. The ice pack around King William Island does not break. The massive floes from the north continue to jam into the strait, piling up in jagged, mountainous ridges called hummocks. The ships remain stuck, frozen solid in the middle of a white desert that shows no sign of life. Then, on June 11th, 1847, the final crushing blow falls upon the leadership of the expedition, Sir John Franklin. His body weakened by age and the silent poison in his veins, his spirit broken by the realization that the ice has defeated him, dies in his cabin. You stand in the cold cabin as the officers gather around the bed of their fallen commander. There is no grand speech, no heroic final words. There is only the quiet, awful realization that the father of the expedition is gone, leaving them leaderless in the heart of the frozen void. They carry his body out onto the ice, away from the ships, and drop him into a trench cut through the floe. As the prayers are read, the wind howls across the wastes, tearing the words from the chaplain's mouth. The command now falls entirely upon Francis Crozier. He stands at the graveside, looking out over the endless, unchanging horizon of ice, knowing that the expedition is no longer an ascent to glory. It has become a desperate, doomed struggle against an enemy that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be fought, and will never surrender. You are sitting at the small, folding writing desk in the captain's cabin of the HMS Terror. It is April 1848, and the world has shrunk down to the radius of a single, sputtering tallow candle. The silence here is no longer just the absence of sound. It is a heavy, physical entity that wraps around your throat and slow releases a cold panic into your chest. For 19 months, the ships have not moved a single inch. The summer of 1847 came and went without a thaw, a cruel astrological joke that left the Erebus and Terror permanently entombed in the relentless, grinding pack ice of Victoria Strait. Look down at the paper beneath your trembling fingers. It is a standard Admiralty polar form, a routine bureaucratic document intended to record geographical coordinates and brief status updates for the record books back in London. But the ink hand written along the margins tells a story of absolute desperation. Captain Francis Crozier and Captain James Fitzjames have just signed their names to a final, tragic decision. The text reads with a clinical, terrifying brevity. The ships were abandoned on the 22nd of April, having been beset since September 1846. Total deaths to date, 9 officers and 15 men. Think about that number. 24 souls, already gone before the march has even begun. Among them is Franklin, and now the full, crushing weight of 105 starving, poisoned survivors rests entirely on Crozier's shoulders. He is no longer a British officer operating within a grand imperial framework. He is a warden of a floating hospice. Step out onto the deck of the Terror one last time before the evacuation. The scene is one of surreal, chaotic devastation. The ships are being stripped of everything that cannot be dragged by human muscle across the jagged ice. The immaculate order of the Royal Navy has dissolved into a frantic, low-energy scramble for survival. Massive wooden whaleboats, weighing nearly a ton each, are being hoisted down from the davits and mounted onto heavy, iron-shod oak sledges. These boats are not filled with practical survival gear because the men's minds, heavily warped by advanced lead poisoning and the neurological rot of late-stage scurvy, can no longer distinguish between utility and madness. Look inside the boats as the men load them. Alongside small quantities of pemmican and chocolate, they are packing massive, absurd luxuries from their old life. There are heavy iron stoves, complete sets of silver monogrammed forks and spoons, lead curtain rods, rolls of fine linen, writing desks, and even copies of Victorian novels. It is a psychological defense mechanism gone haywire. To leave these tokens of civilization behind is to admit that they are no longer civilized men, that they are entering a realm where the rules of the British Empire hold absolutely no power. They are dragging the dead weight of their culture across a desert of ice that does not care about their status, their literature, or their manners. The physical toll of this preparation is staggering. You watch a crew of 8 men strap themselves into the heavy canvas, hauling harnesses. They are emaciated, their cheekbones jutting out like sharp stones beneath yellow, wind-bitten skin. Scurvy has begun to dissolve the connective tissues of their bodies. Old wounds they received as children, long healed, are suddenly tearing open again as the vitamin C deficiency causes their collagen to fail. Their gums are swollen, blackened masses that bleed at the slightest touch, making it impossible to chew the hard ship's biscuit. Every step they take in the deep, powdery snow requires an agonizing act of pure willpower. When the signal is given to begin the march toward the mouth of the Back River, hundreds of miles away across the barren tundra of King William Island, the true horror of their isolation becomes apparent. The ice pack is not a smooth highway. It is a chaotic labyrinth of jagged pressure ridges, vertical walls of ice thrown up by the currents, and deep, treacherous crevasses. To move the massive whaleboats, the men must haul them up and over these frozen mountains. They pull with everything they have, their boots slipping on the slick ice, their lungs burning as the sub-zero air freezes their airways. After an hour of backbreaking, agonizing labor, they look back only to find they have moved less than 100 yards. As the line of march stretches out across the white waste, it looks like a funeral procession for a living army. The psychological cohesion of the crew begins to fracture entirely. On the very first day of the march, men begin to drop out of the line. They do not cry out. They do not beg for help. They simply stop, sit down on a block of ice, and let the drift snow slowly cover their boots. They are too weak to go on, and the men in the harnesses are too weak to carry them. Crozier is forced to make the most agonizing choices a commander can face: to look away from his dying sailors, to leave them behind in the white void, and to keep pushing the survivors forward. The nights on King William Island are a descent into a primal, existential darkness. The men construct crude shelters from blocks of frozen snow, or huddle together beneath the overturned hulls of the whaleboats. Inside these cramped, freezing shelters, The silence is broken only by the sound of coughing, the wet rattle of dying lungs, and the occasional low moan of a man lost in a lead-induced delirium. The heavy metal poisoning has reached its peak. In the darkness, men experience vivid, terrifying hallucinations. They see their wives standing in the snow outside. They hear the church bells of London ringing across the barren tundra. They accuse their comrades of stealing their meager rations or plotting their murders. Trust has vanished. The hierarchy that sustained them for 3 years has finally snapped. Small factions begin to form within the ranks. Officers lose their authority as the men realize that gold braid and naval commissions cannot provide warmth or food. The shared suffering, which should have bonded them together, instead isolates every man within his own private cage of agony. They are alone, utterly alone, trapped at the absolute edge of the known universe, forgotten by the country that sent them and left to rot on a shore that does not even have a name on their maps. You stand at the back of the column, watching the line of men slowly diminish against the vast, empty horizon. They are walking toward a salvation that does not exist. The back river is a barren, frozen waterway that offers no food, no shelter, and no hope of rescue. But they keep walking because the alternative is to lie down and let the frost claim them immediately. They are ghosts, dragging their own coffins across the ice, their minds slipping away into a merciful numbness, their bodies slowly crystallizing in the absolute zero of the polar night. You are standing on the wind-scoured shoreline of Terror Bay, on the southern coast of King William Island. It is the late summer of 1848, and the grand disciplined army of the British Empire has completely disintegrated into a scattered, desperate line of dying men. The illusion of military order has dissolved entirely. The uniform coats, once proud and immaculate, are now tattered, filthy rags encrusted with salt, grease, and human waste. The chain of command has fractured under the weight of an unendurable reality. The men are no longer marching in an organized column. They are moving in small, fragmented bands, isolated survival pods driven by a feral, animal instinct to see the next sunrise. Look down at the gravel at your feet. Scattered across the gray stones are the physical remnants of a civilization tearing itself apart. Here lies a heavy, brass-bound Bible, its pages torn and fluttering in the freezing wind. There, a silver pocket watch, its delicate internal gears rusted solid by salt water. Nearby is an abandoned medical chest, its glass vials of opium and quinine smashed against the rocks. The men have cast away everything that once defined their humanity. They are discovering that when you are starving to death in a frozen desert, the entire weight of human culture weighs less than a single ounce of fat. The psychological descent into the dark has reached its absolute bottom. The lead poisoning, which had been quietly eroding their neurological pathways for over 3 years, has now triggered full-blown clinical psychosis across the remaining crew. You can see it in their vacant, bloodshot eyes. Men wander away from the temporary camps, muttering nonsense to the sky, shedding their clothes in the middle of sub-zero blizzards due to the phantom warmth of advanced hypothermia. The line between reality and nightmare has completely vanished. They are no longer men fighting to return home. They are trapped inside a waking delirium, where every comrade is viewed as a mortal threat, a thief, or a potential source of food. Step closer to a small, isolated camp, tucked into a hollow of rocks near the beach. 5 men are huddled beneath a makeshift tent crafted from a frozen sail. Inside, The silence is thick and suffocating, broken only by the low, agonizing rattle of a dying marine. No one speaks. The camaraderie that once filled the mess decks of the Erebus with laughter and song has curdled into a cold, predatory watchfulness. They sit in a circle, staring not at each other's faces, but at each other's limbs. The ultimate taboo of human civilization is whispering in their minds, no longer as a horrific sin, but as a logical, mathematical necessity. When the Marine finally stops breathing, there is no prayer, there is no moment of silence, there is only the swift, methodical movement of a pocket knife. The physical evidence of what happened on these shores would horizontal line the Victorian world decades later when discovered by search expeditions. If you examine the bones left behind in the gravel, you will see the unmistakable, horrific signatures of survival cannibalism. These are not the random, frantic marks of wild animals. They are the precise, deliberate cut marks of British sailors utilizing their naval pocket knives. They targeted the deep muscle tissues of the thighs and shoulders. More chillingly, the ends of the long bones show signs of being split open with heavy stones, and the skulls fractured open to extract the marrow and brains, a desperate chemical hunt for the vital fats and nutrients that their own failing bodies were begging for. In this horrific act, the true tragedy of the Franklin expedition is realized. They did not just lose their lives, they lost the very thing they set out to defend, their identity as civilized British citizens. In the dark heart of the polar night, the proud sons of the Empire, who believed they were the pinnacle of human advancement, were reduced by nature to the most primitive state of existence. The technology they worshipped had failed them. The society that birthed them was thousands of miles away, and the moral code they lived by had been completely erased by the primal, unyielding demand of the stomach. Captain Francis Crozier, if he is still alive in this final phase, is a man walking through his own personal hell. He has watched his crew transform from elite sailors into a scattered band of cannibals and ghosts. He has maintained his journal to the very limit of his strength. But the entries have dissolved into fragmented, illegible scratches. He knows that no rescue ship is coming. He knows that the Admiralty in London is only now beginning to wonder why they haven't heard from the grand expedition. He stands on the shore, looking south toward the American mainland, realizing that they have actually found the Northwest Passage. They have connected the map, but they have paid for it with their souls, and there is no one left to tell the world the price of the discovery. As the brief Arctic summer fades and the ice begins to close in once more, the remaining survivors begin to drop for the final time. They die in the middle of the march, falling forward into the snow with their hauling harnesses still strapped to their chests. They die in their sleep, huddled together for a warmth that never comes. The white landscape slowly, methodically closes over them, burying the tattered uniforms, the silver spoons, and the fractured bones beneath an unbroken sheet of pristine, silent ice. The fractured empire has been entirely reclaimed by the wilderness, leaving nothing behind but a heavy, echoing silence that will not be broken for more than a century. You are sitting in the upholstered warmth of a London drawing room in the winter of 1854. The hiss of the gas lamps and the crackle of a coal fire offer a stark, almost sickening contrast to the white hell you have just witnessed. Across from you sits Lady Jane Franklin, a woman dressed in perpetual black mourning attire, her eyes burning with a fierce, untamed determination. For years, she has kept the memory of her husband's expedition alive in the British consciousness, shaming the Admiralty into sending dozens of rescue missions into the frozen north. To the public, Sir John and his men are still frozen statues of chivalry, pure Christian heroes standing resolute against the elements, waiting for the Empire to find them. But the door opens, and a man enters who is about to shatter the fragile psychological comfort of the Victorian world. His name is Dr. John Ray. He is an explorer of a different breed, a Scottish physician who does not travel with iron steam engines or silver monogrammed forks. He walks the Arctic on snowshoes, lives in snow huts, and learns the secrets of survival from the Inuit people who have called that desert home for thousands of years. You listen as Ray lays out a collection of relics he purchased from the Inuit near Pelly Bay. The silver forks, the gold epaulets, the familiar initials carved into pocket knives. There is no longer any doubt. The ships are gone. The men are dead. But it is not the deaths that cause the air in the room to turn to ice. It is the testimony Ray has gathered from the native hunters. He speaks plainly, without the filtered euphemisms of high society. He describes a group of 40 white men seen dragging a boat south, their faces blackened by frostbite, their bodies skeletal, and then he drops the final devastating truth. From the mutilated state of many of the corpses and the contents of the kettles, it is evident that our wretched countrymen were driven to the last resource, cannibalism, to prolong a miserable existence. You watch the shockwave ripple through the empire. The reaction is not sympathy, but an explosion of collective denial and narcissistic rage. Charles Dickens himself takes to the printing presses, fiercely attacking John Ray and denouncing the Inuit as deceitful savages. Dickens argues that it is utterly impossible for British sailors, high-principled Anglo-Saxons of the Royal Navy, to have turned into monsters. The Empire cannot accept that its finest sons, equipped with the pinnacle of modern technology, could be reduced to the level of starving animals by the mere absence of food and warmth. They prefer a beautiful lie to a horrific truth. If you fly forward in time, past the decades of denial, you find yourself standing on the deck of a modern, high-tech research vessel in the year 2014. The technology here is beyond anything Franklin could have dreamed of. Side-scan sonar, remotely operated underwater vehicles, satellite tracking. For over a century and a half, the exact final resting place of the Erebus and Terror remained one of the greatest mysteries in maritime history. The ice had guarded its secrets with a jealous, murderous tenacity. Then, a dark silhouette appears on the sonar screen, resting in the shallow waters of Wilmot and Crampton Bay. It is the HMS Erebus. 2 years later, the HMS Terror is found miles away, preserved in the freezing, pitch-black waters of Terror Bay. You look through the lens of an underwater camera as it glides through the drowned officers' cabins. Because of the near-freezing, sterile environment of the Arctic deep, the preservation is staggering, almost supernatural. Plates still sit stacked in the galleys. The captain's desks remain intact, their drawers closed, protecting the logs and journals written by men who knew they were doomed. The ships did not sink in a dramatic, catastrophic battle with the ice. They were abandoned, yes, but eventually, when the ice thawed slightly years later, They drifted ghost-like down the coast, steered by no human hand, until the sea finally opened up and swallowed them whole. They sit at the bottom of the world like time capsules, preserved in a liquid freezer, holding the final secrets of the frozen madness within their timbers. The myth of the Franklin expedition was one of imperial arrogance, a story of men who believed they could conquer the universe with iron and willpower. But the reality left behind in the dark is an echo of warning. It tells us that beneath the thin, fragile veneer of our civilizations, our technologies, and our social codes, we are still entirely dependent on the mercy of the natural world. When the warmth is stripped away, when the food runs out, and when the silence takes over completely, the distance between the highest peak of human civilization and the deepest dark of the animal soul is only a matter of a few frozen days. You are floating gently above the landscape now, untethered from the heavy oak decks, the frozen harnesses, and the agonizing weight of the physical world. The long, white nightmare of King William Island is finally beginning to soften around the edges, dissolving into the quiet, rhythmic respiration of the polar night. The wind that once tore through woolen coats with the force of 1,000 blades has settled into a low, hypnotic hum, a cosmic lullaby, singing across miles of undisturbed, violet-shadowed snow. The struggle is over, the frantic demands of the human body, the desperate hunt for warmth, the agonizing hunger, the heavy poison in the veins, have all been answered by the absolute, merciful peace of the frost. Look down at the vast archipelago one last time. From this height, the boundaries between the land and the frozen sea disappear completely, merging into a single, pristine canvas of absolute stillness. The Erebus and the Terror, resting in their dark, watery chambers beneath the ice, are no longer symbols of human pride or tragic failure. They have been integrated into the ancient natural architecture of the deep. The sea anemones and the Arctic kelp grow slowly along their iron-plated bows. The silent currents glide through the empty cabins where the candles once flickered. The ships have found their equilibrium. They are at rest, cradled by the very waters they sought to conquer, guarded by a silence that will never be broken again. Think of the men who laid down their burdens on these shores. They were not defeated by the wilderness. They were simply folded back into it, the atoms that once formed their fragile human forms, the hands that traced beautiful maps, the voices that sang shanties in the dark, the hearts that pined for the green hills of England, have become part of the great, cyclical rhythm of the North. They are in the crystalline structure of the winter ice. They are in the pale, dancing curtains of the aurora borealis that twist across the midnight sky in ribbons of emerald and violet light. Their stories are no longer written in transient ink on fragile paper, but are etched permanently into the geology of the world. Let the warmth return to your own limbs now. Safely removed from the cold of the past, feel the heavy, comforting weight of your blankets, the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of your chest. The modern world, with its frantic pace, its loud anxieties, and its endless complications, is thousands of miles away, completely irrelevant to the deep serenity of this moment. You are safe, you are warm. The void that swallowed the grand expedition is not a place of terror, but a vast, protective sanctuary where time stands perfectly still and where the burdens of human ambition are gently washed away. The pale sun dips below the horizon for the final time, casting a soft, twilight blue across the endless plains of ice. The stars emerge, one by one, cold and brilliant, staring down like ancient, unblinking eyes at the beautiful, quiet world below. The memory of the frozen madness fades completely, replaced by a profound, all-enveloping tranquility. The map is complete. The passage is found. There's nothing left to do, nothing left to carry, nothing left to fear. As the last echoes of the Arctic wind die away into the dark, let your mind drift over the edge of the horizon, sinking down into a deep, dreamless, and beautiful winter sleep.